She was just his assistant. He was the millionaire CEO. They weren't supposed to fall in love. Charlotte Reed was a single mother with a quiet life, working hard to give her daughter a better future. Nathaniel Hartwell built a medical empire, hiding a grief no one dared to ask about. They lived in two completely different worlds until one night. A fake date at a charity gala turned everything upside down. But was it just a lie, or the beginning of something real? What happens when two people who've lost everything are asked to pretend just long enough to make others believe? And when the lines between pretending and feeling start to blur, how do you protect your heart from something it's never had? Would you walk away from a love that doesn't promise safety, but finally feels true? This is a story about second chances, quiet healing, and the kind of love that shows up not with roses, but with presence. If this story moves you even a little, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more heart-touching tales. Now, let's begin. Charlotte Reed was not supposed to be in that ballroom, not in heels that pinched with every step, not sipping champagne she couldn't afford, and certainly not standing beside the man who signed her paychecks, smiling as if they had arrived together. The Riversong estate was lit like a southern fairy tale, strings of golden lights woven through 100-year-old oaks, marble floors polished to mirror sheen, and the scent of white roses so thick in the air it clung to her skin. It was the kind of place made for legacy names and old money, not for single mothers in department store dresses with rent due next week. Charlotte had come to manage the event. She was here for logistics, not luxury, making sure the donor list was accurate. The valet line didn't back up, and the microphones worked when the mayor spoke. She'd planned to stay in the shadows, clipboard in hand, ready to fix what no one else noticed. Then he arrived, Nathaniel Hartwell. He was later than expected, as always. His driver barely had time to open the car door before the camera flashes began. Charleston's most eligible bachelor, CEO of Hartwell Medical, wealthy, brilliant, private. The kind of man people speculated about over bourbon and brunch. He walked in without a date. That was unusual. More unusual was the flicker of something behind his eyes when he saw Charlotte. She'd only meant to glance his way, to give a polite nod. But instead, she found herself caught in a moment longer than comfort allowed. He moved toward her, not toward the board members or politicians or the PR team, straight toward Charlotte across the ballroom, past the gaze of the curious and the cruel. He didn't speak at first. He simply stopped beside her, close enough that she caught a trace of his cologne, something crisp and expensive, like cedar and salt air. Then, without warning, he reached for her hand. It was steady, warm, intentional. Charlotte blinked. "Come with me," he said, low enough for only her to hear. She barely had time to register the words before he was leading her forward, past clusters of murmuring guests and towards the platform where the evening speeches would begin. Charlotte, disoriented but composed, let her feet move. Nathaniel stopped just before reaching the crowd's center. He turned to face the group, camera lights already flickering around them. His arm rested lightly at her back, not possessive, but protective. "This is Charlotte," he said evenly. "My partner." A beat of silence, the kind that stretches far too long for comfort, even in a room designed for quiet applause. Someone coughed. Another raised a brow. And then the buzz began, soft and swift, like wind rustling through dry leaves. Charlotte smiled. It wasn't a real smile, not the kind that reached her eyes, but the kind she'd perfected over years of needing to survive awkward dinners, difficult meetings, and rooms full of people who never quite saw her. The whispers started immediately. Charlotte Reed, his partner. She felt the stares burrow into her back. Questions filled the space around them like smoke. Was this real? Since when? Who was she? She could feel her heartbeat in her wrists, her throat, the soles of her feet. Nathaniel remained composed, nodding politely to colleagues and donors as if everything were perfectly ordinary. He offered no explanation, no glance of reassurance, only his presence, solid and unwavering, beside her. She played along. That was the only choice. They stood together through a short toast. Someone took a photograph. Someone else made a joke. Charlotte heard none of it. She was too focused on standing still, breathing evenly, not letting her voice tremble when she responded to polite questions she didn't know how to answer. When the attention shifted elsewhere, Nathaniel leaned closer. "Thank you," he murmured. Then he stepped away, excusing himself toward the governor's table as if they had not just turned the entire room on its head. Charlotte stayed for another 5 minutes, maybe 7. She wasn't sure. The air felt thicker. Her hands were damp. She slipped out through a side corridor, grabbing her coat from the staff room, heels already in hand. The cold floor was a welcome relief. Outside, Charleston's spring air wrapped around her like a half-remembered lullaby. Spanish moss swayed above the sidewalks, and a distant saxophone played from a rooftop bar down the street. She walked the 3 blocks to where she'd parked. Her car was the only one without a valet tag. She liked it that way, quiet, simple, unseen. She didn't say a word until she was home. Ellie was asleep, curled under her favorite quilt. The apartment was still. She placed her shoes by the door, peeled off the dress that no longer felt magical, and stared at her own reflection in the hallway mirror. She whispered the words to herself, like trying them on for size. "This is Charlotte, my partner." And though she knew better, knew it meant nothing, that it was a moment born of convenience, some small part of her felt different. Not better, not changed, just seen. That night, Charlotte walked home alone, but her name was already being whispered in the rooms where power played. Rumors in Charleston didn't whisper. They rang like church bells on Sunday morning. And by Monday, the whole city heard Charlotte's name. The morning after the gala, Charlotte woke to sunlight spilling through thin curtains and the soft rhythm of her daughter's feet on the wooden floor. Ellie always woke up before the alarm, always with a kind of quiet joy that felt both natural and, to Charlotte, miraculous. They shared breakfast at their small kitchen table, 2 bowls of oatmeal, 1/2 banana sliced between them, and a shared glass of orange juice. The apartment, a 2-bedroom walk-up in a building built long before central air was standard, carried a familiar creak in the floorboards and the faint scent of lavender from the neighbor across the hall. Charlotte packed Ellie's lunch with practiced hands turkey sandwich, apple slices, 2 cookies, and a note folded neatly with a smiley face drawn in red ink. She kissed the top of Ellie's head before sending her off with the school carpool. Then, as always, she turned to the mirror by the door, adjusted her cardigan, and left for work. But nothing about that Monday felt routine. At Hartwell Medical, eyes lingered a moment too long when she walked past. 2 administrative assistants stopped their conversation mid-sentence when she stepped into the break room. In the elevator, someone cleared their throat awkwardly and smiled too wide. She wasn't used to being seen. Charlotte had always built her world on quiet contributions and background strength. She fixed schedules, handled contracts, proofed documents her value was, in the fact that no one ever had to clean up after her. But now, people were looking, and she knew exactly why. It was the way they asked, "How was your weekend?" with a twist of curiosity. The way the office manager offered her coffee just how Nathaniel likes it, followed by a wink. It was the receptionist's comment about the flowers in the conference room. "They say lilies mean devotion. Romantic, huh?" Charlotte kept her posture straight, her answers short, and her smile faintly amused. She refused to let them see her shift under their gaze. Nathaniel, for his part, said nothing. He passed her in the hallway twice that day. Once on the 3rd floor near the HR suite, he nodded slightly. The second time was as she stepped out of the elevator and he stepped in. Their eyes met. He held the door half a second longer than necessary. But still, no words, no explanation. By Tuesday, the whispers had made it outside the office walls. Her landlord, Mrs. Clemens, a wiry woman with an endless supply of floral aprons, knocked on Charlotte's door with a jar of homemade pickles. "I saw you in the paper. Sugar," she said, voice coated with syrupy charm. "Got yourself a handsome fella, haven't you? I always said you were too pretty to stay single long." Charlotte blinked. "Excuse me." "Oh, Don't be modest, Mrs. Clemens held up a folded newspaper. There, grainy but unmistakable, was the photo Nathaniel and Charlotte at the Riversong Gala, standing together, his hand at her back, both framed in golden light. The headline read, "Hartwell finally has a heart." Charlotte felt her breath catch in her throat. She accepted the pickles with a forced smile and a murmur of thanks, but her hands shook slightly as she shut the door behind her. She set the jar on the counter, unopened, and sat down at the table, staring at the folded newspaper. She hadn't sought this. She hadn't asked for it. She turned the paper over, pressing the photo face down as if that might bury the truth it carried. That night, she found herself doing something she rarely allowed, letting her thoughts wander to what it all meant. She sat on the couch, a blanket around her legs, a book in her lap. She wasn't reading. The room was dim, lit only by a single floor lamp, and Ellie was already asleep in the next room, her gentle breathing a small comfort in the stillness. Why hadn't he said anything? Why choose her, of all people, in that moment? Was it just convenient strategy? Or had he seen something in her that she didn't see in herself? Charlotte hated speculation. She'd spent years avoiding it, keeping her life clean, simple, quiet, no drama, no scandals, no entanglements. She couldn't afford them, not with a child, not with a job that barely covered expenses. But his silence lingered. It was almost worse than the rumors. Not knowing, not understanding. And if she was honest with herself, if she stripped away the pride and the fear and the caution, there was something else, too. A warmth she didn't want to name, a flutter she thought she'd outgrown. It wasn't love, it couldn't be, but it was something. The memory of his hand at her back, the steadiness of his voice when he said her name, the way he didn't look at her like she was out of place. She told herself it was nothing, just a ripple, just a mistake he'd never mention again. But when she walked into the office on Wednesday morning, there was a new arrangement of white lilies at the front desk, and on the wall behind reception, the same photo had been framed and added to a growing gallery of Hartwell Medical's community involvement. Her image now hung among dignitaries, senators, and smiling patients. And still, Nathaniel said nothing, no call, no email, no explanation, just that photo, that silence, that space between them growing louder every day. Charlotte tucked her hair behind her ear as she passed by the frame, chin slightly lifted. She didn't stop walking, she didn't look back, but the echo of that night, the weight of his hand, the sound of her own name in his voice was something she couldn't quite shake. He called her into his office at 7:12 p.m., a time when the world outside had already begun to rest. But something inside her stirred awake. Charlotte had been about to shut down her computer, the last one left in the corner cubicle that had always felt more like a borrowed seat than a rightful space. The office had gone quiet, save for the distant hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional click of a distant door. His voice came through the intercom, not abrupt, not commanding, just steady. "Charlotte, if you're still here, could you stop by?" She hesitated, a pause not long enough to be noticeable, but long enough for her own thoughts to race. Then she stood, smoothed the front of her blouse, and walked the familiar path down the hall. Nathaniel's office was large but not cold. Bookshelves lined with medical journals and leadership memoirs. A bar cart no one ever used. A window that framed the Charleston skyline in warm tones of amber and fading gold. He was seated behind his desk, jacket off, tie loosened. His sleeves were rolled up just enough to show forearms that had known more boardrooms than hard labor, but still held a quiet strength. He looked tired, but in a way that made him seem more human than powerful. He gestured to the seat across from him. "Thank you for coming in." Charlotte sat, keeping her posture careful, her hands in her lap. The silence stretched for a moment too long. He wasn't looking at her, not directly. Instead, he glanced at a file on his desk, then back out the window. "I need to ask you something. Unorthodox," he began. She didn't respond, just waited, breathing slow, eyes steady. He cleared his throat softly. "You've seen the articles, the whispers, the pictures, A pause. They've led to unexpected interest. Charlotte tilted her head slightly. Interest to potential investors, a major hospital chain. They're suddenly more eager to move forward. He gave a slight shrug. Apparently, a man in love seems less risky than a man alone. The sentence hung in the air like a scent you can't quite place. I want you to help me continue the narrative, he said. Just for a month, public appearances, dinners, events, a few photos, nothing more. Charlotte's fingers tightened around the strap of her purse. You want me to pretend? I want us to pretend, he corrected gently. There it was, out in the open. She looked at him. Now, really looked. His jaw was tight, his eyes unreadable. He wasn't asking out of sentiment. This was a business pitch, a calculated offer, a move on a chessboard she didn't know they were playing. I'll pay you, he added, enough to cover Ellie's tuition for the full year. Private school, if you want. No strings attached beyond the appearances. Charlotte inhaled slowly. The mention of Ellie's name did something to her spine, like a string being pulled taut. He noticed. Of course he did. This isn't about control, he said. You can say no, you should. If it feels wrong, wrong. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked past him, toward the window, where the city lights had started to flicker like stars unsure of their own brilliance. She thought of Ellie's backpack with the fraying zipper, the overdue dentist appointment, the way her daughter looked at piano lessons, flyers with quiet longing, never asking. She thought of the dignity she'd fought to keep, even when counting coins at the grocery store. The way people looked at her now, some with envy, others with suspicion, and then she looked back at Nathaniel. You're the only one I can do this with, he said quietly. Anyone else. It would feel fake. That line struck something she wasn't prepared for. Was it a compliment, a confession, or just a well-placed phrase meant to soften the edge of the ask? Charlotte's voice, when it came, was soft but steady. There are rules. Then, of course, no assumptions, no blurred lines. Understood. This doesn't leave the surface. He nodded. Her heart beat against her ribs like it wanted to argue. But her mind, practical and weathered by years of survival, stayed firm. She reached for the manila folder he slid across the desk. Event dates, talking points, a schedule dressed up like something casual. Her fingers brushed his when she took it. He didn't flinch, neither did she. But the contact felt warmer than it should have. She stood. I'll do it, she said, for 1 month. He met her gaze, and for the first time in the entire conversation, something flickered behind his expression. Not victory, not gratitude, relief. Still, he didn't smile. Charlotte turned to leave. At the door, she paused. She didn't know why, just that something unsaid sat heavy between them. She didn't turn back, only said, "Don't make me regret this." His answer came after the soft click of the door behind her. But she didn't hear it. She nodded, but the agreement tasted like copper in her mouth, too sharp to swallow fully. The first time she stepped into Nathaniel's riverside home, Charlotte realized wealth didn't just buy space, it bought silence. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that echoed, wide, polished floors. Ceilings so high they seemed to breathe on their own. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Ashley River, where sailboats drifted by like passing thoughts. Everything gleamed surfaces untouched, art perfectly placed, air faintly scented with something too subtle to name. There was no clutter, no fingerprints, no framed photos of childhood or travel. It was a home that had been lived in carefully, not intimately. Charlotte stood just inside the foyer, hands clasped loosely in front of her, and let herself absorb it. The silence, the distance, the weight of a space designed to impress without inviting. Nathaniel appeared beside her, his voice soft. "You okay?" She nodded. "It's quiet." He gave a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. That's what most people like about it. But Charlotte wasn't most people. Over the next 2 weeks, she followed Nathaniel into a world that was curated and polished, full of handshakes that lasted too long and smiles that didn't touch the soul, cocktail parties in glass towers, dinners where the menu had no prices, conversations thick with coded language legacy, scalability, optics. She knew how to blend. Years of parent-teacher meetings, navigating custody hearings, and living in a city that judged silently had made her fluent in masks. But there were moments brief and unsettling when she caught him watching her, not with pride or possession, but with something quieter, like curiosity edged with guilt. At a charity gala for cancer research, she met his mother. Vivian Hartwell was elegance personified. Hair perfectly silver, not a shade too early. A silk shawl draped over her shoulders like it belonged there since birth. Her eyes, blue and sharp, scanned Charlotte like a resume. "You work for my son," she said evenly. "I do," Charlotte replied, "and now you accompany him." Charlotte held her gaze. "For now." Vivian tilted her head slightly. "Well, you wear restraint better than most." It wasn't praise. It wasn't insult. It was something in between. Nathaniel appeared beside them before Charlotte could respond. He didn't speak, just slid his hand gently to Charlotte's back, an anchor, perhaps, or a signal. Vivian smiled with polite teeth. "Well, she's certainly more composed than the last one." Charlotte didn't ask what that meant. She didn't have to. The room told her everything. On Thursday evening, they attended a quiet dinner with board members. The table was long, the wine flowed easily, and the conversation circled around fiscal quarters and international expansions. Charlotte said little. She knew her role present, poised, forgettable. But when one of the guests made a joke about single mothers in the workforce veiled as humor, laced with condescension, Charlotte's fingers stiffened around her fork. Nathaniel didn't laugh. Instead, he turned, calm and measured. Charlotte raised her daughter while working full-time. He said, without help. While many of us were still figuring out which golf club to join, silence. Then a few nervous chuckles. Someone cleared their throat. The subject changed, but Charlotte felt it, the shift. He hadn't needed to say it. He hadn't even looked at her when he did. But it landed, deep and sharp, a line drawn, a protection she hadn't asked for and yet felt moved by. Later, as they waited for a car to take them back, Charlotte stood near the curb, arms wrapped around herself. Nathaniel stood beside her, hands in his pockets, eyes on the passing headlights. "Thank you," she said quietly. He didn't look at her, just nodded once. They didn't speak the rest of the ride. It was the small things that caught her off guard. The way he handed her a glass of water without asking how she liked it. Room temperature, no ice, just as she preferred. The way he remembered she didn't drink coffee after 4. The way he stood just close enough in a crowd that she never felt alone, but never too close to make her feel possessed. One evening, the car service dropped them off early near King Street, an error in scheduling. Rather than wait for another ride, they walked. The city was alive in spring warmth. Street musicians played soft jazz. Couples walked hand in hand, and the scent of jasmine trailed from balconies. They passed an old bookstore, tucked between 2 buildings like a forgotten breath. Charlotte paused. "Want to go in?" Nathaniel asked. She didn't answer, just pushed the door open. Inside, the air was cool and dusty, spines of books leaning like old friends, the kind of place where stories outlived people. She moved through the aisles instinctively, fingers trailing the shelves, eyes scanning for something familiar. She stopped in the classics section. Her hand brushed the worn spine of Jane Eyre. "I was 13 when I read this," she murmured. "Borrowed it from the school library. I cried for a week." Nathaniel stood beside her, silent. "I didn't understand it all," she continued, "but I knew what it meant to be unseen, to feel like you had to earn love by surviving. Still." He didn't speak, just reached up, gently took the book from the shelf, and turned it over in his hands. Then, without looking at her, he placed his hand lightly on her shoulder. Just for a second. Just enough. Charlotte stilled. It wasn't part of the plan. It wasn't performance. The touch was soft, thoughtful, unsure. She didn't pull away. He dropped his hand, and for a moment, neither moved. Then she took the book from him, tucked it under her arm, and walked toward the register. Outside, the city hadn't changed. The world spun on. Cars passed. Laughter echoed. But something between them had tilted imperceptible to others, undeniable to them. Charlotte didn't speak the rest of the way home, and Nathaniel didn't try to fill the silence. Somewhere between fiction and reality, a story neither of them expected had begun to write itself. Everyone carries a past, but some pasts, like Nathaniel's, echo louder in silence than in words. Charlotte had been to his home 3 times before that night, but this was the first time she came alone. No tuxedos, no event, no cameras waiting outside, just her, in a soft navy sweater and jeans, holding a bottle of wine she couldn't pronounce properly, and a heart that hadn't quite decided whether it was anxious or open. Nathaniel greeted her at the door, in rolled-up sleeves and bare feet, a version of him she hadn't seen before. The house smelled of roasted garlic and something earthy like rosemary or thyme, and she realized, faintly amused, that he'd actually cooked. They ate in the sunroom. It wasn't really a room, more like a glass box overlooking the river, lit softly with wall sconces and the occasional flicker of boat lights reflecting on the water. The air was cool, but not cold, quiet, but not empty. Conversation moved easily at First Ellie's school play, a disastrous board meeting, a patient letter that made him stop mid-sentence for just a second too long. Laughter came in small, cautious waves, like stepping into a pool one toe at a time. Then, somewhere between the second glass of wine and the silence that followed dessert, Charlotte noticed the photograph, a small silver frame on the far corner of his desk, partially hidden behind a sculpture of abstract bronze lines. The photo was slightly tilted, the kind of detail most people would correct without thinking, but Nathaniel hadn't. She leaned forward, quiet. "Can I ask who that is?" He didn't answer immediately, just turned his gaze to the window. Then, without looking at her, he said, "My son." The room changed. She felt it before she processed it. A shift in temperature, in air pressure, in time itself. "I didn't know you had a child," she said softly. "I did," he replied. "For 48 hours. Charlotte sat still, breath shallow. "He was born early. Complications. They told us he'd have a 50-50 chance. He made it through the first night." Nathaniel's voice was low, like it belonged in a church or a memory. "I held him the next morning. He was so small, I could fit him in one hand." A pause. Charlotte didn't speak. She knew this kind of silence. It wasn't meant to be interrupted. He passed that evening. "They told me he went peacefully. I'm not sure if that's supposed to help." "It doesn't," she said, almost without realizing. Nathaniel finally turned to her, his eyes searching not for pity, but for understanding, for confirmation that this moment, this sharing, wasn't a mistake. He would have been 12 this year, he said. Charlotte reached for her glass, more to steady her hand than to drink. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "So was I," he replied. She looked at him, not at the CEO, not at the man the city speculated about, but at the father who lost a child before he could become one. His name was Samuel, he said. We'd picked it out months before, his mother. We weren't together anymore. But we agreed on that. Charlotte's throat tightened. She could see it now, the shape of Nathaniel's distance, the architecture of his restraint. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't emotional poverty. It was armor, built brick by careful brick, after the kind of loss that rewrites you. "I don't talk about him," he said quietly. "No one ever asks." She nodded. It was a long moment before she spoke again. "I gave birth alone," she said. "Ellie's father was supposed to meet me at the hospital. He never came, changed his mind, about me, about being a parent. Nathaniel looked at her not with surprise, but with the kind of stillness that says, "I've seen that, too." "I didn't cry," she added, "not until after she was born, not when the nurse handed her to me, not when I signed the forms alone, but when they brought me dinner, just mashed potatoes and cold green beans, I looked down at that tray and I lost it." A faint smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. "Green beans. They were terrible," she said, "but they broke me." They sat in the warmth of each other's quiet for a while longer. The kind of quiet that doesn't press, doesn't prod, just is. He stood, eventually, and walked to the fireplace, lit it with a match, slow and methodical, like it mattered. The fire flickered to life. Charlotte moved to the couch, tucked her legs beneath her, and let the soft light paint the edges of the room. Nathaniel joined her, not too close, just near enough that their shared silence had weight. "I never told anyone about that night," he said. "I haven't either," she replied. They both stared at the flames. Outside, the river kept moving. Inside, the world held still. "I think people believe grief is loud," Charlotte said, crying, shouting, breaking things. "But mine wasn't. Mine just sat with me, like a shadow, like a second skin." Nathaniel nodded. "It makes you quieter. Not because you want to be, but because the noise hurts." She turned her head slightly toward him. "You're afraid to feel again? I'm afraid to fail again." That landed somewhere deep inside her. She looked down at her hands, then back at the photograph on his desk, still slightly crooked. "Love isn't a project," she said. "You can't manage it like a company." "I know," he said. "But knowing doesn't stop the fear." She didn't move closer. She didn't offer a comforting hand. Some wounds weren't ready for touch, but her presence was steady, soft, whole, and that, for now, was enough. That night, nothing happened, but for the first time, nothing felt enough. "We could make this real," he said. "A stable home, a future for Ellie. No surprises?" But love, she thought, was nothing if not a surprise. Charlotte hadn't expected him to say it, not like that. Not so early in the evening, not with his voice wrapped in logic instead of longing. They were sitting on the back terrace of his home, where the stone tiles still held the warmth of the afternoon sun, and the river murmured its usual lullaby just beyond the edge of the garden. The sky was painted in shades of peach and violet, and Ellie was inside, coloring quietly after dinner. Everything was calm. Everything was too calm. Nathaniel sat across from her, elbows on the table, hands folded like a man making a presentation to the board. He spoke of logistics, of schools with better programs, of neighborhoods with quieter streets. He spoke of parenting schedules and health insurance, of the tax implications of shared living. It was a plan, a safe one, but not once did he say the word love. Charlotte kept her face still, the way she'd learned to in courtrooms and job interviews, and moments when she needed to disappear behind her own skin. But inside, something shifted, quietly, deeply, like a door closing in a hallway she thought she'd left open. "I care about you," he added, sensing her silence. "You're steady, smart. You already know my world. Steady, smart, like describing a foundation or a well-written resume." She looked down at her hands. Her knuckles were white from gripping the edge of the chair. "I know this isn't romantic," he said quickly, "but it's safe. It's solid. For both of us." Charlotte looked up, finally, met his eyes. He meant it. He wasn't playing her. He wasn't trying to manipulate her. He genuinely believed this was the right path. And that broke her even more, because she wasn't a decision. She wasn't a line item on his 5-year plan. And most of all, she wasn't safe. She stood slowly, pushing back the chair with the soft scrape of metal against stone. "Charlotte," he said, rising too, uncertain now. She held up a hand not angrily, but gently, the way one might silence a child asking a question too soon after bedtime. "I can't," she said. "Why not?" he asked, truly confused. She looked away. past him, toward the river, the sky, anything but his face, because I want Ellie to grow up seeing what love looks like, not what comfort looks like, not what control looks like. His brow furrowed. This isn't about control. No, she said, quietly. It's about fear. Yours, mine. And I don't want to build a life out of fear. He took a step forward, unsure of what to say, but Charlotte had already stepped back. I would have said yes, she said, if you had just once called it what it was. If your voice had trembled, even a little. If you had looked at me like I was more than a variable in your life equation. She didn't cry, not then. She only turned, walked toward the door, and said over her shoulder, "Tell Ellie I'll call her tomorrow." She handed in her resignation 2 days later, printed neatly, no typos, one paragraph, no reasons listed. She left it on his assistant's desk just before noon, the same time she used to bring Nathaniel his midday briefing. She didn't wait to be called in. She didn't pack much, just her favorite pens, a framed photo of Ellie, and a small potted plant she'd managed to keep alive for 3 years. When the elevator doors closed behind her, she felt something inside her loosen. But it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like grief. Nathaniel read the letter in silence. He stared at it longer than necessary, as if more meaning might appear if he just held it in his hands long enough. She was gone. No farewell conversation, no confrontation, no tears. Just a clean break, the kind that hurts more because it leaves no mess behind. Charlotte did cry. That night, long after Ellie had gone to sleep, after the dishes had been washed, after the trash had been taken out, after the house had gone still. It started when she opened the kitchen drawer and saw the measuring spoons Nathaniel had bought her for their pretend cooking segment on that charity live stream. She hadn't used them since. She sank to the floor, back against the cabinet, knees pulled to her chest, and she cried, not for him, not entirely, but for the version of herself that had believed, just for a moment, that someone might choose her not out of fear of being alone, but out of love. She wept for the silence between them, for the glances that almost meant something, for the way his hand had hovered near hers but never quite held it, for the fact that she had felt something real in a world built on pretending. Nathaniel stood in his office that night, the lights off, the city shimmering outside his window like a world he no longer recognized. He thought of her laugh, rare, restrained, but real. He thought of her fingers brushing a book spine, her shoulders tightening when she felt judged, her voice when she said Ellie's name. He didn't understand why she left. He only knew she was right to, because love wasn't a choice on a checklist. It wasn't a project. It wasn't safe. And he'd tried to build something risk-free with the one woman who had risked everything just to stand beside him. And in that quiet resignation letter, she wrote no reason. Because sometimes, heartbreak didn't need explaining. It simply needed space. Charlotte never meant to leave anything behind, but children have a way of doing what adults cannot. They write what others fear to speak. It had been nearly 3 weeks since Charlotte left Hartwell Medical. The chair she once sat in was now empty. The small plant gone. The soft scent of her perfume long faded. The office hummed on without her, as offices tend to do, emails sent, contracts signed, meetings scheduled, but her absence lingered, not loud, not disruptive, just felt like a song that had once filled the room, now playing only in memory. Charlotte and Ellie had moved to Somerville, a quieter suburb, all shade trees and winding sidewalks. Her aunt owned a small house there, with a front porch that creaked and hydrangeas that bloomed like they had stories to tell. It was a good place to begin again. Charlotte took freelance work where she could. Ellie enrolled in a new school and made fast friends with the neighbor's dog before the neighbor himself. The days passed gently, predictably, but some nights, when Ellie had gone to sleep and the house fell still, Charlotte sat at the edge of her bed, wondering if she had mistaken fear for strength or strength for fear. At Hartwell Medical, Thursday mornings were reserved for executive strategy meetings. Nathaniel sat at the head of the long glass table, suit crisp, tie perfectly aligned. He spoke in measured tones, reviewed slides, nodded when appropriate. The team was mid-discussion on regional expansion when his assistant knocked gently, slipped inside, and wordlessly handed him a small envelope. No logo, no return address, just his name, written in round, careful handwriting with two little stars drawn above the I in Hartwell. He frowned slightly, set it aside. But something about the envelope pulled at him, not urgently, just quietly. 10 minutes later, he opened it. The room faded around him. The letter was written in blue ink, smudged slightly in the corners. No date. No greeting. Just this. My name is Ellie. I'm 8. I'm not supposed to be writing to you. Mom doesn't know. She used to work with you. You probably know that. She's the one who keeps everything in order even when her own heart isn't. We live with my aunt now. Mom says it's just for a while, but she always says just for a while when something is going to last longer. I heard her cry last week. She was folding towels, and she didn't know I was there. I asked her what was wrong, and she said, "Nothing, sweetheart. Just tired." But she wasn't tired. She was sad. I know the difference. She thinks she's not the kind of person people stay for. She once told me love is for stories, that it's too messy in real life. I think she's wrong. I think she's just scared. Or maybe someone made her believe it. I don't know what happened between you and my mom, but she smiled more when you were around. And I think you smiled more too, even if it was just a little. If you don't want to talk to her, that's okay. But please don't forget her. Some people are too quiet to be remembered unless you try. Love. Ellie Charlotte's daughter Nathaniel didn't move. The boardroom was still murmuring around him, someone debating logistics, someone else adjusting a projection. But he heard none of it. The only sound was the rustling of the letter as his hand began to shake. His throat tightened. He read it again. And again. The words blurred slightly at the edges. Not from age, but from salt water he hadn't tasted in years. She thinks she's not the kind of person people stay for. The sentence carved through him like wind through stone. Not sharp, just constant, deep. He thought of her hands. The way they moved when she was nervous straightening things that didn't need straightening. He remembered how she always paused before answering, like she weighed every word carefully, even if the moment didn't demand it. He had thought she was cautious. But now he saw she was wounded, graceful about it, quiet in her survival, but wounded nonetheless. And he had offered her safety, when what she needed, what she deserved, was love, not steadiness, not shelter, but the raw, terrifying, beautiful surprise of being chosen with a full heart. He folded the letter slowly, once, then again, until it was small enough to disappear into his palm. No one in the room noticed when he stood, or, if they did, they said nothing. He walked out without a word, not in anger, not in panic, but in clarity. He stood in his office, alone, the morning sun slanting through the tall windows. He held the letter in both hands now, as if afraid it might vanish if he let go. There had been so many days, so many years, when nothing could move him. Not praise, not profit, not failure. He'd worn detachment like armor, and it had served him well, until now. Because for the first time in as long as he could remember, Nathaniel Hartwell cried, silently, not violently, not dramatically, just freely. Tears slid down his face, uninvited and unstoppable, like a dam breaking somewhere deep inside, not just for Charlotte, but for the son he lost, for the love he'd never known how to accept, for all the times he chose silence when the moment begged for words. When the tears stopped, he stood for a long time. Then he opened the small drawer inside his desk, the one that held nothing but an old key and a photograph of Samuel. He placed Ellie's letter beside them, folding it into the space as if it had always belonged there. Then, slowly, he reached for his coat. Inside, he slipped the letter into the inner pocket, close to where his heart had forgotten how to beat. The first time he saw her again. It was raining on King Street, the same bookstore, the same ache, but no words between them. It was a late Saturday afternoon. the kind of Charleston rain that fell slow and steady like a hymn hummed through a cracked window. The streets shimmered with puddles that mirrored street lamps and bulbed storefront signs. Umbrellas bloomed like quiet flowers, moving past one another in soft, unspeaking choreography. Charlotte hadn't planned to stop by the bookstore. She and Ellie had come downtown for new rain boots, but Ellie spotted the familiar green awning and tugged insistently at her hand. Just for a minute, she'd pleaded, and Charlotte, despite herself, had agreed. The bell above the door chimed as they stepped inside, trailing the scent of damp leaves and warm fabric. The air was filled with that soft, musty comfort only old paper and time could make. Charlotte shook the water from her umbrella, her eyes scanning the shelves instinctively. Ellie ran off toward the children's corner in the back, her raincoat flapping like a tiny flag of freedom. And that's when she saw him, standing in the aisle where poetry met history, coat still damp on the shoulders, was Nathaniel Hartwell. He wasn't facing her, but somehow, he knew. He turned slowly, and their eyes met. No one spoke. The world didn't pause. It moved on as usual. Pages turned. A register dinged. Somewhere in the back, someone laughed over a joke too quiet to hear. But for them, the moment stretched. Charlotte stood still, the weight of months pressing against her ribs. She hadn't imagined seeing him like this. No preparation, no warning. Just rain and books and breathless silence. Nathaniel didn't move toward her. He just looked differently than before. His expression was softer. Not with pity, not with longing, but with something deeper. Something like understanding. Charlotte held her coat tighter. Her fingers gripped the collar like it might shield her from memory. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, and then, like a flicker of light through shadow, Ellie appeared. She spotted him immediately. Mr. Hartwell. She darted across the room, boots squeaking against the wooden floor, and wrapped her small arms around his waist without hesitation. Nathaniel let out a breath, not a laugh, not a sigh, just a quiet exhale, like something long held had finally been released. He bent slightly, placing a hand on the top of Ellie's damp hood. "I missed you," she said simply. Charlotte's throat tightened. Nathaniel crouched down, meeting Ellie's gaze. "I got your letter. Did you like it?" He nodded. "Very much." Charlotte stepped closer, instinctively. The moment wasn't hers, not entirely, but it was hers to protect. Nathaniel stood again, and now he was only a few feet away. Their eyes met for a second time. Still, no words. He didn't apologize. She didn't explain. There were too many sentences between them, and none of them had found the right beginning. He started, but then stopped. Charlotte waited, but only for a breath. Then she offered a quiet, polite smile, the kind she used to wear in boardrooms, when emotions weren't allowed, and gently touched Ellie's shoulder. "We should go," she said. Nathaniel nodded. "Of course." But just as she turned to leave, he stepped forward, reaching into his coat pocket. I have something." He held out a book, worn, leather-bound. The title nearly rubbed off from years of hands and shelves. Jane Eyre. Charlotte blinked. She took it slowly, unsure. Then Nathaniel added, barely above a whisper, "Page 214. She didn't ask what that meant, didn't speak, didn't thank him, only nodded, and walked out the door with Ellie's hand in hers, the bell above them chiming a soft, reluctant goodbye. The rain hadn't stopped. It came in waves now steadier, heavier. They walked the 5 blocks to the car in silence, Charlotte holding the book under her coat, pressed against her side like something fragile. Ellie chattered about nothing in particular. Charlotte nodded at the right moments, but her mind was far away, turning pages she hadn't opened yet. It wasn't until after dinner, when Ellie had gone to bed, and the house was lit only by a small lamp in the living room, that Charlotte remembered the book. She sat on the couch, legs curled beneath her, and opened the cover. There was a note tucked between pages 213 and 215, not folded, not sealed, just slipped in gently. as if it had always belonged there. His handwriting was neat, strong, but this time slightly uneven. Dear Ellie, you were right. Love is for stories, but stories are not pretend. They are where truth hides until we're ready to speak it. Your mother is not a woman who isn't worth staying for. She is a woman I didn't know how to stay with. That's not the same thing. But I didn't understand that until your letter. Thank you for your courage. Tell your mother. I remember the bookstore, the firelight, the way her silence filled every room like music. If she ever wants to write a new story, one without pretending I'm ready to read every word. Yours. Nathaniel Charlotte didn't cry at first. She just stared at the page, reading it twice, then again. Then the tears came, quietly, not with sobs, not with pain, but with something like relief. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, a page had turned. He had built his empire on logic, on numbers, on plans. But love never asked for permission. It only asked for presence. Nathaniel Hartwell had spent his life solving problems, formulas, forecasts, people. He could walk into a crumbling department and rebuild it in a quarter. He could negotiate $1 million deal before lunch. He could charm investors, navigate crises, and make decisions that others agonized over, all with precision. But he couldn't solve her. He couldn't even speak when she walked away. And now, sitting across from his mother in the quiet dining room of her Mount Pleasant home, Nathaniel did something he rarely did. He admitted he didn't know what he was doing. I think I loved her, he said softly, staring down at the tea he hadn't touched. His mother looked up from her knitting. She'd stopped mid-row. Think she asked, her tone gentle but firm. Or no, he swallowed. No. The word left his mouth like a confession, not of guilt, but of vulnerability. And somehow, that was harder. His mother set her yarn aside. Then why are you sitting here and not with her? Nathaniel didn't answer right away. He looked around the room at the paintings she'd collected over the years. The grandfather clock that never quite kept time. The chair his father used to nap in. So many things unchanged. I was afraid, he said finally. She didn't rush to comfort him. She just listened, the way mothers do when they know their children need to speak more than they need to be saved. I gave her logic, he continued. Stability, safety, I thought. It was enough. And now she asked. Nathaniel looked out the window. Rain again? It always seemed to follow him lately. Now, he said, I want something real, even if it's not perfect, even if I don't know how to hold it. His mother stood slowly, walked to his side, and placed her hand on his shoulder. She didn't speak, just squeezed once. Sometimes, that's all we need. That night, he couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, the sheets too cold. The memory of her Charlotte, with her steady voice and tired eyes that still held wonder too close. He walked through his study, fingertips grazing the spines of books she once looked at, and then he paused. His hand rested on Jane Eyre. He opened it. The letter he had written Ellie tucked inside weeks ago was still there. But beneath it, there was something else, a note he hadn't remembered placing. It was her handwriting, just one line, scrawled on a post-it from long ago. Sometimes the safest place is still not home. He sat down and wept. The next morning, he returned to the bookstore. The bell chimed. The shopkeeper, an older woman with half-moon glasses and a memory like steel, raised her eyes. You're back, she said. Nathaniel nodded. I'm looking for something. A gift. No, he said. A way back. She didn't ask what he meant. Instead, she led him to the fiction aisle. She always lingered here, the woman said. Bronte, Woolf, a little Toni Morrison when the weather turned. Nathaniel ran his fingers across the worn covers. She liked the sad ones, he murmured. Don't we all, the woman said with a soft smile. He bought 5 books that day. Not to give, just to read, to understand. Then he began writing. Once a week, after dinner, he sat at his desk and wrote Charlotte a letter. He didn't mail them, not yet, but he wrote anyway. He told her about the books he read, what lines reminded him of her, what Ellie's letter had stirred in him. He wrote about Samuel, his son, how he used to dream of him learning to walk, how he used to imagine a family that never came to be. He wrote about his fears, how he confused safety with love, how he built walls so high even he couldn't remember what they were guarding. And week after week, the words came easier, the truth less heavy, the ache, somehow, more bearable. He saw Ellie again 2 weeks later. It was at the park near the Somerville Library. She was on the swings, her hair wild in the wind, laughing with abandon. He didn't approach at first, just watched. But then she saw him and ran. Mr. Hartwell. He smiled, bent down, let her hug him like she had before, as if nothing had changed, as if everything had. They sat on a bench, talked about school, books, a turtle she'd seen by the lake. He asked about her mom. Ellie's face softened. She still cries sometimes, but she's trying. He nodded. So am I. She looked at him. Ernest, do you miss her? Yes. He said, every day. Then tell her. Nathaniel blinked. Even if she doesn't believe it at first, Ellie added, she'll still hear it. And sometimes hearing is the beginning. He didn't answer. But that night, he wrote again. Charlotte, I used to think love was something that needed to be deserved, that I had to earn it by being perfect. But love doesn't come to those who build walls. It comes to those who break them down. I don't want safe anymore. I want true, even if it's messy, even if it hurts. I want a life that includes your laugh, your silence, your strength, and your uncertainty. I want Ellie's stories. I want slow mornings. I want to try, not as a plan, not as a strategy, but as a man who finally understands what it means to choose someone fully. I don't know if you'll read this, but I'll keep writing. Because maybe love is still a story worth writing. N. He folded the letter. This time, he placed it in an envelope and wrote her name on the front, not in neat corporate print, but by hand, like something real, like something meant. Some words, when spoken right, don't fix the past, but they make the future possible. The envelope was cream-colored, thick, with her name handwritten in black ink, unmistakably Nathaniel's script. It had no return address, but she didn't need one. The moment she saw the curve of the C in her name, her breath caught. It had arrived with the morning mail, wedged between a grocery flyer and an insurance statement. She held it carefully, as though it might dissolve in her hands if she gripped too tightly. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she set it on the kitchen counter and moved through her morning, like a woman trying not to step on a memory, making toast for Ellie, folding a stray sweater, watering the plant in the windowsill. But the envelope stayed where it was, waiting, quiet, like it understood time was part of the process. When Ellie left for school, Charlotte made herself a cup of tea. She carried it to the table, sat down in the same chair where she'd once signed her resignation letter, and finally slowly slit the envelope open. The letter was written on a single sheet of paper, no greeting, no closing, just a series of words laid bare, unprotected by formality. I once believed that strength meant keeping everything inside, that if I didn't speak it, I wouldn't feel it, that silence was safer than vulnerability. But silence cost me more than I realized. I gave you steadiness when you needed tenderness. I offered plans when you needed presence. I was afraid to say the words out loud, because saying them would mean they were real, and real meant risk. I didn't trust love because the last time I let it in, it destroyed me. But you were never here to destroy me. You were here to teach me that broken doesn't mean incapable, and that quiet doesn't mean empty. I'm not writing to win you back. I'm writing to tell you that you were right. Love doesn't live in plans. It lives in the pauses, in the doubt, in the courage to say, I want this. Even when you're scared, you deserve those words from me. Not because you needed them, but because I did. And now, finally, I'm ready to say them. I loved you, I love you, and I'm sorry it took me so long to find the right way to say it. Charlotte sat still for a long time after finishing the letter. The tea had gone cold. The shadows on the floor had shifted. But inside her, something had warmed. He hadn't begged. He hadn't bargained. He hadn't tried to rewrite the story. He had simply spoken, and for once, every word landed. She didn't cry. She didn't smile either. Instead, she folded the letter with deliberate care, pressed it flat between her palms, and set it aside. She stood, walked to the window, and watched as the breeze moved the lace curtain beside the sill. It wasn't forgiveness she felt, not yet. It was something more fragile, a soft loosening, the quiet letting go of pain that had overstayed its welcome. That afternoon, Charlotte picked Ellie up from school. They stopped at the bakery on the way home, picking out 2 scones, 1 blueberry, 1 lemon. Ellie talked about her music class, how she was learning to play a new piece on the piano. Charlotte listened, really listened, not with her ears, but with her whole body. At home, while Ellie practiced, Charlotte sat on the couch, the letter still echoing in her chest. She could hear the hesitant notes from the piano drifting into the room, uneven but honest. She closed her eyes. I loved you. I love you. The words weren't fireworks. They were a hearth fire, steady, patient, warm, and that was what she needed. Not a promise, not a plan, just proof that she had been seen. Truly. She rose, walked to the small desk in the corner, and took out a note card. Not a letter, not a long reply, just a sentence, a small truth of her own. She wrote, I needed to hear that. No more, no less. She didn't sign it. She didn't seal it right away either. Instead, she placed it next to Nathaniel's letter and returned to the living room. Ellie was still at the piano, now repeating a section slowly, working through each measure. Charlotte sat beside her, said nothing, but Ellie smiled, just knowing she was there. Outside, the sky held the faintest hue of evening. Inside, for the first time in a long time, Charlotte no longer felt like she was surviving a story that had already ended. Maybe it wasn't about rewriting the past. Maybe it was about finally knowing how to begin again. And maybe he'd say more. Maybe she would too. But for now, this was enough. Some people return with roses, others come with open hands, and hearts finally unguarded. When Nathaniel arrived at Charlotte's door, it was late afternoon. The sun was beginning its descent, casting soft gold along the porch railings and turning the world the color of forgiveness. He didn't bring flowers, no speech rehearsed in the car, no promises written in haste, just himself, in a worn navy coat, collar slightly bent, hands visible, shoulders steady, eyes quieter than before, but no longer hiding. Charlotte opened the door and paused. The air between them filled with all the things unsaid, and yet, somehow, nothing needed to be rushed. You're here, she said softly. I didn't want to wait anymore, he replied. She didn't step aside immediately. Instead, she studied him not for answers, not for apologies, but for truth. And what she saw wasn't the man who once stood behind a desk, guarded and silent. It was someone standing on her porch now, unguarded, present. She nodded once, stepped back, and let him in. They sat in the kitchen, not across from each other like strangers, but not beside one another like lovers either, just together. A teapot sat on the table between them, steam curling slowly into the air like a breath exhaled after holding it too long. I read your letter, she said. He nodded. I didn't expect it. I didn't expect to write it, he admitted. There was silence then, but not the tense kind. This was the kind that makes room, that lets people find their words in their own time. Charlotte reached for her tea, took a sip. I've been thinking about starting something, she said. A class for single mothers, life skills, budgeting, legal basics, the kind of things no one teaches us, but we're supposed to just know. Nathaniel's expression softened. That sounds like something that should exist. I want it to feel like a place where women can breathe, she added, without being looked at like they're broken. He leaned forward slightly, fingers tracing the rim of his mug. I've been considering expanding the foundation, he said. Something small, local, a community health center focused on preventative care for women and children who can't afford traditional access. Charlotte looked at him. Not surprised, just moved. We could do it together, he offered, gently. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her eyes to the window. Outside, Ellie was chalking stars on the sidewalk, one careful line at a time. Charlotte smiled faintly. We'd have to do it right, she said. No names on plaques. He agreed. No speeches. Just help. She looked back at him. And this time, she saw not the man who once wanted control over everything, but the man who now understood the value of sharing it. Charlotte reached out then, not quickly, not dramatically, but deliberately. She placed her hand over his. It was the first time she had touched him without obligation. Not because of a contract, not for show, not for Ellie, just because she wanted to. Nathaniel looked down at their hands, then up at her. His voice was low, almost reverent. Thank you. She didn't reply, didn't need to, because her hand stayed there. And for them, that was enough. Later, they walked outside. The air smelled like earth and chalk, the sky soft with the quiet of evening. Ellie waved from the lawn. Nathaniel waved back. Charlotte watched them. Something steady rising in her chest, not certainty, but permission. To hope again, to try again. Not because it was guaranteed to work, but because she finally wanted it to. Nathaniel turned to her. Can I see you again? Charlotte tilted her head slightly. You're seeing me now, she said, and he smiled not wide, not flashy, but real. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a folded slip of paper, and pressed it into his hand. Something I wrote. She said, not a reply, just something. He didn't open it right away. He just held it, like she had once held his, and that, too, felt like something sacred. That night, Nathaniel sat in his car outside her home for a few moments before starting the engine. He unfolded the paper. In her handwriting, familiar, thoughtful, were just a few lines. You didn't come to save me. You came when I had already saved myself, and that's why I can meet you here. Not where we were, but where we could be. See. He closed his eyes. The world outside was still uncertain. The road ahead was still long, but between them, something had settled, quietly, finally, fully. Years later, Ellie would find the letter folded neatly inside a book titled Love and Other Quiet Miracles. It wasn't addressed to her, but it was always meant for her. The house by the river wasn't grand. It didn't echo with marble floors or chandeliers. It didn't overlook a city skyline or come with a gated drive. Instead, it smelled faintly of rosemary and coffee. The floor creaked near the hallway. The garden bloomed with wildflowers more than plans, and each room felt like someone had once laughed there and stayed. Charlotte loved it in ways she never thought she would love a place again, not because it was perfect, but because it felt earned. There were mornings when Nathaniel would read on the porch with a blanket around his shoulders, and Ellie would practice piano inside, the soft notes reaching the water like prayers. There were nights of shared dinners, of grocery runs with forgotten lists, of arguments about who left the porch light on, followed by quiet apologies and forehead kisses. There was life, and there was peace, not the kind that comes from stillness, but the kind that comes from surviving. It had been a year since they had opened the Riverstone Community Center. The building stood near the edge of town, not far from the old elementary school, modest in size, but generous in heart. The waiting room held donated toys. The nurses knew patients by name. And every Tuesday, Charlotte taught her life skills class in the small conference room with laminated handouts and too few chairs. Nathaniel came on Thursdays. He didn't wear a suit anymore. Not there. Instead, he wore kindness like a second skin. He spoke with warmth, listened more than he advised, and made sure the clinic shelves were never short on prenatal vitamins or empathy. Ellie had found her rhythm too. She was 11 now, growing taller by the day. Her music teacher said she played like someone twice her age, not because of technical skill, but because of emotion. She feels what she plays, he said once. And that's something you can't teach. Charlotte had smiled then, because that was Ellie. And maybe, somehow, that had always been Charlotte too. One quiet Saturday morning, Charlotte sat by the window with a pen in hand and a cup of tea by her side. The house was still. Nathaniel had taken Ellie to her lesson, and for the first time all week, the silence was hers. Before her was a sheet of thick paper, unlined. She wasn't sure why the words had begun forming in her head, but they had. And sometimes, you write not because someone asked, but because the words won't stop knocking until you let them in. She titled the page simply, "For Ellie, on your 18th birthday," and began to write. My sweet girl, if you're reading this, then somehow, time has moved as it always does quietly, without asking permission. You're 18 now, maybe your hair is longer, maybe you still hum when you do your homework, maybe you still hate Brussels sprouts, or maybe, like me, you've learned to roast them with garlic and call it adulthood. Wherever you are, I want to tell you something I once didn't believe for myself. Love isn't perfect. It doesn't always arrive wrapped in certainty. It doesn't come with guarantees, and it will, more than once, ask you to be braver than you feel. But love, true love, isn't about someone fixing you. It's about someone seeing you fully and staying. I once thought I had to be strong all the time, that no one would love a woman who cried at night when the world felt too heavy. And then you were born. And I realized that strength isn't in the silence, it's in the softness, in the reaching, in the showing up again. Even when it's hard, I want you to know that the man in our life today didn't come to save me. He came when I had already learned to stand again. He came not to lead me out of the storm, but to walk beside me in it. You once wrote him a letter. Do you remember? You told him that love was for stories. And darling, you were right. But not because stories are made up. Because the best ones are real. And ours. This messy, beautiful, broken then mended story is the greatest one I've ever known. I hope that, when you love, you'll choose someone who listens to your quietest words, who holds your truth gently, who sees your past, but loves your present more. And I hope more than anything that you'll always know you don't have to earn love. You only have to let it in. Mom Charlotte folded the letter slowly, with care. She tucked it between pages 132 and 133 of a worn book titled Love and Other Quiet Miracles, a novel Nathaniel had bought her on one of their early bookstore visits. She placed it on the shelf beside Ellie's childhood art projects and a jar of river stones labeled Good Days. And then she went outside. The porch was warm from morning sun. Ellie sat cross-legged with a sketchbook, drawing birds she couldn't name. Nathaniel brought out 2 cups of coffee and sat beside Charlotte in the creaky swing. They didn't talk much, didn't need to. Love, Charlotte had learned, didn't always speak loudly. Sometimes it sat beside you in silence, and that was enough. She leaned into his shoulder, and somewhere along the line, a fake night had become the beginning of the greatest love they ever knew. Absolutely. Below is a 200-word life lesson summary drawn from the full story, crafted with warmth and depth, and tailored for a mature audience, especially those over 50 who value emotional truth, reflection, and second chances. Sometimes, love doesn't arrive when we're young, fearless, and ready. It comes later when we're bruised, wiser, and quietly rebuilding, and that's when it matters most. This story reminds us that healing doesn't always come in grand gestures or perfect words. It comes in presence, in choosing to stay, in listening to someone's silence, not just their speech. Charlotte didn't need saving. She had already saved herself. Nathaniel didn't need fixing. He needed to be seen, together. They learned that love isn't about certainty, it's about courage. For those of us who've lived through heartbreak, loss, or long years of silence, this is the lesson: you are never too old, too broken, or too late to be loved well. The greatest love stories don't start with fireworks. They begin in the quiet moments when someone holds your truth and stays. So, if your heart is still open, even just a little, let it be found. Not perfectly, but honestly, because the love that finds you in your most human moments is the love worth keeping. Thank you for spending your precious time with this story. If it touched your heart, even in the smallest way, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue to tell stories that heal, connect, and remind us all of the quiet power of love. We're grateful to have you here. See you in the next story.